Welcome to the Divine Counsel Worldview podcast. In this episode, we're going to be handling Genesis 28, the story of the ladder that Jacob dreams about, and then also 29 and 30. That's the Jacob-Laban story where he serves his uncle for a total of 14 years, and during that time has the sons of Jacob, or the 12 tribes, born to him. So we'll handle that together at the end of this podcast. Good to talk to you again, Mike. I think we could jump right in. We mentioned last time, and we had, you passed along that story of your Chinese heritage, where conversion is so climactic in some cultures compared to our own Western culture, where it can be. I think I saw a Gallup poll a while back now, but that said, or there was a claim of 1/3 of American youth have at some point asked Jesus into their heart. And it just shows that conversion in our Western model can be so, well, I don't want to say unassuming, but it can be part of a culture almost, that you go to a youth group on a Wednesday night or a Sunday night and you do it and you come home and you may even forget about it. It brings back a memory of a vacation Bible school that I ran actually when I was in college for my home church in Wisconsin, a little rural church of 100 people, but we had kids, come from the neighborhood. And I remember one particular one where after we had numerous, this is back in my college days, so I shudder to think of what I said as far as what the gospel was, but, kids that prayed the prayer. And I remember going to one house in particular, knocking on the door, little Billy. And, I said to them, because little Billy had made a confession. I had it on a piece of paper, he had prayed the prayer, and I saw him through the screen, and he was on his belly watching Saturday morning cartoons. And the mother came to the door, and how do you say this? But I remember hemming and hawing a little bit, trying to, in my best way of trying to get myself in the door so I could talk to Billy and, thank him for his time at Vacation Bible School and talk about his conversion, frankly, because he had done it, right? And the mother acted as though Billy had never, why are you bothering my kid, basically? And, he came, but why do you need to talk to him, was her answer back. And I just remember watching through the screen, that little boy there thinking, my own thoughts were, I wonder what happened to him. I mean, did he actually, because, he waved at me, but he had no other interest that I could tell of continuing the conversation. And the mother certainly didn't. She was quite opposed to him talking to me. So, in our culture where praying a prayer and asking Jesus, to come in our heart can be a truncated version of the gospel compared to what you described last time about a Chinese person really having to give up so much of their past and how they thought of worship. We're in that same context here in Genesis 28, and we're going to test drive this, I think, today, Mike, because I think it's a fair test drive, and that is Jacob's path to Yahwism, which Hebrews chapter 11 says ended well. He, in faith, he spoke to his sons the final blessings of Genesis 48-49. Mm-hmm. And he's called, or he is part of that triumvirate, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob will be commonly how God is defined even in the New Testament. So he will become Jacob's deity, Yahweh will. But is the path to that something that we can even see in the text as a path, a literal path? I'm going to start with 28:10. And again, feel free to jump in as you would like to, Mike. So 28:10. Now Jacob went from Beersheba, that's where they're living at the time, and remember he had been told by his father at the beginning of 28, do not marry any women like your brother Esau from the area of Canaan, again because of the non-Yahwism, I'm sure, that was rampant. So he heads up to Haran. His uncle Laban lives up there, who was the brother of his mother. Rebecca. So he came to a certain place. Now we're going to learn later in verse 19, this is Bethel.
Mm-hmm.
Luz was the original name of the city, and it's renamed, might be here or in the next story, to Bethel. And we're going to notice why, in fact. Verse 19 is going to say it used to be called Luz. So if you want to put Luz in verse 11, that would be more accurate for the story. He came to Luz and stayed there all night because the sun had set. Again, in this day, when the sun goes down, you don't have streetlights, so it's time to pack it in and find a place to rest. He took one of the stones of that place, put it at his head, and he lay down in that place to sleep. And he dreamed, and behold, a ladder was set up, a stairway. That same word can be understood as a stairway. So this would be, if you recall our conversation of Genesis 11 and the Tower of Babel, the tower is not the important thing as much as that stairway that was on the side of a ziggurat, which invited the gods down to the temple in which they could be worshipped by humans, or for humans to walk up. This is all presumed in that ancient culture of Mesopotamia and beyond, that you would make a ziggurat for the sake of that stairway. You needed a very tall, in the case of Babylon, the one we've uncovered is seven stories high, that this long stairway, the purpose of it was to both invite the gods down to us so we could worship them in their temple, and also to be an entryway for us into their place of abode, where we would get to the top of that ziggurat. And that's the point of Genesis 11, where it says the height was in the clouds, that you would, from that top, you would sacrifice to a deity as though you're in his home as well up there. So I think, and in most commentaries, and especially ones that are concerned with a cultural background, see verse 12 as a ziggurat that he is envisioning, and the stairway that's part of that ziggurat setup. So let's read it that way. He dreamed, and behold, a ziggurat was set up on the earth, and its top reached, just like Genesis 11, its top reached to heaven.
Well, Ron, can I maybe interject a little bit here? Where I'm looking at one of our favorite kind of study Bibles here, the Cultural Backgrounds Bible. So I think this was written by Walton.
Right.
On this note, he doesn't think. He says he didn't. He writes, Jacob did not see a ziggurat, but the stairway portal between heaven and earth that ziggurats were designed to provide. So I think maybe it was a ziggurat, but maybe it was more so of that the ziggurat was like a earthly picture of what the stairway was supposed to look like. But here for Jacob, he actually saw the actual.
Oh, okay. So Walton is taking the position that he's seeing the stairway of the ziggurat and not the ziggurat itself. So less if I'm reading behind Walton's point, less the humanly devised way of thinking of it and more the actual, obviously symbolic to some degree, but the actual portal. Spiritual. Upon which, or portal through which these divine beings are coming and going. Yeah. Interesting. And really, that's what we want to get to for verse 12. Here's where a divine counsel worldview, again, if you're just imagine yourself in a Bible study or preaching and you are coming to verse 12, one way to do it is just give let's read it the way my Bible has it. Then there were the angels of God ascending and descending. It sounds harmless, right? This is what angels do. And I'm thinking of all the movies of Hollywood that have angels coming and going, and Michael Keaton, a molting angel standing at the refrigerator having a Budweiser. That scene I can't get out of my head. The idea that angels are just these, they're coming and going and they do God's bidding or not, but they're not really incidental to the bigger picture of the Bible. Here's where a divine counsel worldview would stop the story and say, okay, guys, let's reread this verse the way it's intended to work. And there, so he sees this ladder reaching to heaven, and there the messengers, no angels. These, what I would say if I could look up from the Bible and look at my audience, I would say there are no angels. Remember that. There are no angels, because as soon as you say that, you're thinking Dante in the medieval period. These are messengers of Elohim. They're divine messengers. These are gods. Here's the way to prove that. Have your audience turn to 35:7. Go forward to 35:7. And here's one of those examples that I recommended the new NIV when I told that story about going into the hotel suite and having 10 minutes with the general editor to recommend 19 or 20 places where we need to put the word gods in plural in the biblical text. Here it is, 35:7. This is Jacob. He built an altar there and called the place, well, back up one verse. So Jacob came to Luz, that is Bethel. In other words, this is the story of Genesis 28 retold, which is in the land of Canaan, he and all the people that were with him. And he built an altar there and called the place El Bethel, the house of El, okay? Because there God appeared to him. But why would I recommend that's a small g? In fact, you could put plural on that because the verb appeared is plural in Hebrew. So literally it reads, because there the divine beings appeared to him when he fled from the face of his brother. That's, in other words, go back and read 28:12 with 35:7 intact, and you have to go with, I'm going back to 28:12 now, and there the messengers of Elohim / deities were ascending and descending on it. So, any thoughts there, Mike? It just the way we read the verse, to me, is clearly, when you read an English version, like I have again the New King James in front of me. I mean, I'm not aware of any version that puts gods there, but that's what needs to be there based on even a simple reference to 35:7, which has the word gods in plural. It tells you what he saw in verse 12.
I think when you combine it with chapter 35, there is a good likelihood that it's actually, it is actually talking about divine beings. It's talking about plural Elohim. And I mean, it's just supposed to leave that little bit of ambiguity, right? Because usually translators will want to say God because they want to sort of have a more direct connection to the place being called Bethel. And so house of God or house of El. And then they want to say that it was God who revealed himself. And that's on a grander scale. Yes, God did reveal himself, like the God revealed himself. But what Jacob initially saw, a bunch of messengers going up and down this stairway that exists between the realms of heaven and the realm of earth.
We have mentioned this idea of a portal before, but let's stop with verse 12 and kind of remind ourselves or remind the hearer what we've talked about before. Back in Genesis 12:7, very early on the story of Abraham being brought into fellowship with Yahweh, you have that phrase, Yahweh appeared to him, and then he makes an altar in 12:7 as though it's these memorial altars were often part of, again, in that culture where you met a deity. And they could just be incidental in the sense that you remember a spot. Remember, they come through, the Jordan River, and God has them put up some memorial stones. So it's not meant in a lot of the narratives of the Old Testament to be a place of like magic or something like that. But the idea that you have an encounter with a divine being and you put a memorial stone or an altar there is often part of their culture. 12:8, Genesis, Bethel, again, the mention of the name Bethel. And he makes another altar there and he calls upon the name of Yahweh as though the Bethel spot in the ground, which again, it gets its name later, like right now. But back in 12, that spot is also part of a story when Abraham comes there and calls on the name of Yahweh and builds an altar on that spot. And then in 13:4, it mentions again Bethel by name. So the point is that Bethel as a spot on the ground, and you can go there today. I was the last time I went to Israel was in 2017, and the guide we had, which I had before, he's an American teacher. He had met a guy who was living in Israel, who had found, in his opinion, this is just opinion on his side, but he had found that spot in Genesis 13, which was between Ai and Bethel. It's defined very carefully. And so we took a bus ride that one day, and it was fun because he showed, based on, I forget exactly how he did it, but the geography of these rolling hills that we could stand basically. And then when you get there and you stand there and there's pottery and evidence of a previous, culture, that he recommended we are standing on the actual spot where we have Abraham going in Genesis 13. So the point being that you can go there today, as it were, and it's got to be there somewhere close, between Ai and Bethel. And that seems to have been in an early story a place that we would call a gate of heaven. The reason I say that phrase is because in 28 now, where we are, when we move up to verse 17, you know what? Let's read the story instead of skipping. How about we just read it? Verse 13. And behold, Yahweh stood above it, that being the ladder. So he's at the top with these deities going back and forth, messenger deities going back and forth. And he says, I am, now let's test drive this, Mike. And I'm doing this without, as we're starting the episode, it just occurred to me that this would be a good way to ask the text, does my view work as I read it? My view, as we said at the beginning, is that Jacob went on a journey to decide whether he was going to have Yahweh as his Elohim or not, that this isn't a quick choice for him. So let's see if this works. Verse 13, Yahweh says, I am Yahweh Elohim of Abraham your father and the Elohim of Isaac. That's your dad. So your grandfather and your father had me. Now notice he doesn't say, I'm yours. Maybe that's still up for grabs. The land on which you lie, I will give to you and your descendants. Well, that would hint toward, if I'm reading, see if you agree with me, that's kind of hinting toward the idea that he knows that Jacob will fall in line and become a Yahwist. 14, also your descendants shall be as the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east, to the north and the south. You and your seed, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So, in one sense, so far so good. He has said, I'm the father of your grandfather and father, or I'm the God of your father and your grandfather. Here's what you're going to do. And the kind of language we're hearing is Yahwistic language, right? It's the promise that goes with being Abraham's seed.
Ron, but before let's also just notice, right, that 13, it's Yahweh himself, right? Yep. Who's standing at the top of the ladder, right? So it's kind of funny, right? The general ancient Near Eastern thought would be, yes, this ladder is very important. This portal is really important. We're getting messages from the gods or maybe from the top god. But instead of sending a messenger, it's Yahweh himself at the top of this ladder yelling down back to Jacob himself.
Back in 11, Yahweh comes down the ladder, and here he stands at the top of the ladder.
Yeah. And sort of like there is, yes, this distance between them, but it's one, I think, is to show that he is the head honcho. He is the guy that all of these other messengers are running up and down for.
That's why they're running up and down. Yep.
Yeah, because he's at the top, and he's saying back directly to Jacob, I am the God of your father Abraham and of the God of Isaac, your father too. There's this interesting thing of that Yahweh is taking a very personal moment here to introduce himself directly to Jacob. Which,
to follow through on our test driving, I'm leaning as I read this, thinking Jacob wants Yahweh. He's probably defaulting to Yahweh. Is that fair? That nothing scary. In other words, you don't have Yahweh condemning Jacob for not choosing Yahweh.
No. And I think it's also just really that Jacob hasn't come to fully sort of what I had said earlier in previous podcasts of how, in some sense he is writing a little bit on the heritage that he got from his dad Isaac and then from his grandfather Abraham. But he hasn't had a moment like this before where Yahweh himself is speaking to him like Abraham and Isaac had. Yeah, and I think this is the first moment. This is the first moment. And it's such a direct, in your face, hi. Yahweh is introducing himself through this very powerful imagery. of like,
Yeah,
hi,
and-
yes,
and,
I am Yahweh.
And to be fair, I think I'm trying to remember. Okay, so Isaac does have Yahweh appearing to him in 26:2. We're not
Yep.
told how. And of course, we have Yahweh appearing to Abraham in 12, in 12 and on 17, 18. So, in one sense, this is the time when Yahweh appears to Jacob, because until then, we don't have Yahweh appearing to Jacob personally, but now we do.
Oh,
Fair enough.
yeah.
So
And I
this
think
would be
this
his
is why
invitation.
it's so memorable for Jacob.
Yeah.
Right? This is he's finally seeing like, okay, I've culturally I know about this ladder, I know about this portal, I know about divine beings, messengers going up and down this ladder, bring messages or taking messages back up. But he has a direct encounter with the head of this whole entire deal. And this head God is taking the time to personally introduce himself to Jacob. And that's amazing.
Yeah. Could I recommend, again, this is just a side issue, but to me, it's right on topic. When we say divine counsel worldview, personally, and Mike and I talked about this, Dr. Heiser and I, that maybe counsel's not the best word because it gives the sense of sitting at a board meeting, you got reports in front of you and you got the CEO walks in and sits at the head of the table, it has that kind of a feel that obviously is metaphorical. But when we say counsel, that same word in Hebrew can just mean assembly. And that assembly obviously presents a case, and here's my recommendation coming out, that and it's not good on a divine counsel worldview podcast that I say this, but I would rather call it the plural Elohim worldview. In other words, whatever that counsel is doing, and we have so little said about the quote counsel of gods, I would rather, and that phrase is largely coming from the Baal cycle and other non-biblical texts, that what we can have in the Bible is, instead of a council concept that runs the idea, we can have more just the concept of a plural group, as again we've said before, a society of beings, a society of divine beings, which at least some of them, we're not sure how many, have been delegated power over the kingdoms of the earth. By the time you get to Jesus' day, this is what we know. God runs the show, Yahweh does, but he's also created a group of beings. They're not angels. That's the key. They're not just angels. They are actual deities. They're called Elohim. They're called Theoi in Greek. And these deities have power that has been delegated to them by the Creator. And my point is that when you go to like a Daniel chapter 3, and you hear Nebuchadnezzar, who is speaking Aramaic and has never had a class in Israelite theology, and he looks into this is Daniel 3:25. I looked into look, he says, I see 4 men loose walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the form of the fourth is like a B'nai Elohim, or Bar Elohim in Hebrew, in Aramaic. And he's using this, I would recommend, general wording or phraseology that any ancient would use to mean a divine class being. A divine class being is in that fire. And then 3 verses later, this is the important part for my argument here. Nebuchadnezzar then, when those 3 boys come out, say, "Blessed be the Elohim of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his messenger and delivered his servants." So the Son of God, as it were, in 3:25 is called a malach in 3:28. Just showing that in their language, they could include malachim as gods, as, that there was the same classification of being, which now bring it back to the Genesis 28 story. The fact that we have the word angel in our English Bible, again, cross that off in my mind and put messenger of Elohim. Messengers of Elohim would in the ancient world be thought of as Elohim themselves, right? So even the divine council concept, I would even say you could have coming up and down that ladder council members. Long way of saying something I could say awfully quickly, I guess. But when we think of the divine council worldview, I think personally of these beings that are in charge of the earth, in charge of nations, as able to come and go, because that's what they're doing. I mean, that's what a authority figure would do. So who's at the top? Yahweh alone. I don't have any of those Elohim standing with him at the top. I have him at the top, and all of these quote unquote council members or divine Elohim, whatever you want to call them, they're the ones coming and going. And thus, that's why angel doesn't work for me, because it would relegate, it would put a word on there that just misses the point. Am I making sense?
You are making sense, but can I offer a little, like, maybe a pushback, or maybe sort of like an expansion, right, on the word council? Like, I agree with you about the word angel. It gets very confusing. And, sometimes there's a little bit of also like, well, when I'm depending on who I'm talking to, I will use the word angel because I know that when they hear it, they're going to think immediately of a divine being, but they wouldn't think of it in that phrase, right? So there's that. There's always about the context of who you're speaking with. But I think I still like the word council, but that's also because I'm coming from an Asian American background, where one of the regular things, I grew up with was watching, also interestingly, a lot of Chinese miniseries and Hong Kong movies and whatever else. And now these days, as an older adult, I've moved on to watching a lot of Korean dramas.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And one of the interesting things for me is that as a Westerner, we are so unfamiliar with the concept of a monarch, or a concept of even just like the throne room of a monarch. Right. And I know in Western, depictions, especially like more recent ones, like, The Crown or, Elizabeth or whoever, the room is like a giant room and it's pretty empty. There's the monarch and maybe one or two advisors, and that's it. But in these Korean like kingdom dramas at times, like they have an entire set that is just filled to the brim with actors, all portraying different governors, different bureaucrats, different soldiers, even the soldiers are part of that council scene. Even though they're not making decisions or governing, yet they are also considered part of this whole entire king's royal court, this king's council. They're providing the security for it, so to say. And mm-hmm. So I do think that maybe the word divine, the phrase divine council still can work, but we have to start adjusting our mindset from a Congress to more of a throne room. Of like, what does it mean that you have one guy, one king who is the center, and like where all the thoughts and decisions are directed towards and coming from, and that everyone in that scene is interacting primarily with this one head being. And I think that's part of why I think when we consider things like an unseen realm or the kingdom of heaven, and then the kingdom of earth, like there is this almost like this idea that the kingdoms need to be reunited. And so like, that's why it works for me, because I have in the back of my mind this running imagery of a Korean king who is interacting with his head advisors, his bureaucrats, and yet they still call him old great king, and they leave the final decisions up to him to make. Right. But they are also making strong suggestions. They're making this, on the spot decisions on behalf of the king, hoping that it will honor the king.
Yeah. All right. Let me then push your illustration even farther, based on New Testament. So I think we're arguing kind of the same, but I just want to push it even farther. In Ephesians 3, (10), to the intent that now the manifold wisdom of God might be made known by the church to the principalities and powers in the heavenly places, according to the eternal purpose which he accomplished in Christ Jesus our Lord. We have had it said earlier in Ephesians that they were made, that he has been, 120. When he raised him, Jesus, from the dead and seated him at the right hand in the heavenly places, far above all principality and power, and might and dominion, in every name that is named, and has put all things under his feet. So the picture of the New Testament, I'm going to drop it there for time, is that the principalities and powers not only were made by Jesus, that's in, I forget which text, Colossians 1, but they are responsible to Jesus. In the final story, Jesus has, and remember that's the fourth point we make in our summary of the Divine Council worldview, that Jesus is in the place of highest honor. By the time we end the New Testament, however we get there, we have Jesus put in the place of highest honor above all principalities and powers, which, here comes the Divine Council idea then, that's those guys. The gods that are in that throne room scene are called in the New Testament not demons. They're not, well, Paul never calls them demons. Paul calls them principalities and powers. Okay. Then you have John 1:51, this very enigmatic thing that Jesus says to Nathanael, you are the King of Israel, John 1:49. Jesus answered and said to him, because I said to you, I saw you under the fig tree, do you believe? You will see greater than this. And he said, here's the greatest it can get, John 1:51. You will see the heavens open and the angeloi of God, again, don't read angel there, the messengers of God ascending and descending upon me. And I take that to mean they're going to be doing what Jacob saw is going to be, I'm the final result of that story. And however the descending upon and so forth, ascending and descending would be, they report to me now, something like that. So, and I don't think I'm contradicting anything you're saying. I'm just adding layers to this quite developing story in the Bible, that whatever these beings coming down in Genesis 28 upon Jacob are, they seem to be picked up in the New Testament as the principalities and powers that Paul warns about, that Paul knows are there, and that even worship Jesus through the demon-possessed people that bow down and worship, that kind of stuff. And I'm throwing a lot at you there, Mike, but is that making sense?
Well, Ron, I agree with you, and I think also let's not miss out on just this interesting parallelization that's happening, right? That he's telling Nathanael, he's reminding Nathanael of this scene that Jacob saw of the messengers, the malach going up and down this portal, and at the top of this is Yahweh, and so he's saying, like, you know, they're ascending and descending on the Son of Man, and like the Son of Man, that title is in the place of Yahweh. Anyways, we can leave it at that, but it's just so interesting. Well, he's using this imagery.
We've got a lot to do. The Divine Council worldview has got a lot to unpack, including Jesus saying that at the beginning of John, making you say, what are you talking about? You mean that whole story back in Genesis 28 finally lands on you? And that, of course, Jesus would say with a wink, oh, do you have a lot to learn? And so, you and I are both students of this more than teachers of it. I always say, you'd agree, we're not scholars of this. There's no way you can be a scholar in this material. This is something we're sitting at the feet of the greatest book of all time, trying to understand the mind of God and the biblical writer. And we'll do the best we can, but so much to unpack here. So anyway, verse 15, behold, now Yahweh talking to Jacob. Again, I get the sense, let's test drive our idea, that Jacob is kind of going through this process of figuring out, will I take Yahweh as my deity or not? Behold, I am with you, and I will keep you wherever you go. That's the kind of deity I am. And will bring you back to this land. That's chapter 35. For I will not leave you until I have done what I have spoken to you. This kind of gets into the idea of a vow in the ancient world was often initiated by a deity, and you would, once performing the vow, you would then give the deity a gift or something like that. You would thank the deity for what he did for you, because again, a vow went both ways. I would promise to the deity something, and the deity would give it back to me, and then I would give him a gift in return. So you get that feel that this is an appeal for a covenant, as well as, in a sense, promising that the covenant will be good. Because again, if Jacob will say yes, obviously Yahweh has said yes right here. Verse 16, then Jacob awoke from his sleep. Now, why was it a dream and not reality? I don't know. I've often wondered, why doesn't God speak in dreams better to me? I mean, I get dreams and I don't know whether God is speaking to me or not. I once talked to Mike about this. Remember a car ride. I forget where we were. You know how you're talking. The best conversations men ever have are in their cars. I don't know why, but I was talking to Mike and I said, we talk about dreams. And he said, I've had this recurring dream a couple times, or two, 3 times, that I'm at a farmhouse, and I forget the color. There's a certain color farmhouse, a repeated dream where the farmhouse is on fire, and I'm trying to get my girls out of there. At that point, Calvin wasn't born yet. And I said, what do you think? Do you think God gave you that dream? And in classic Mike form, he turns and says, I don't know, and I don't care. I'm just never going to buy a farmhouse that's red, or whatever color it was in his dream. He always had a good retort to any of my questions, and that was one of them. I'm just never going to buy a red farmhouse. And so in this world, again, the ancient world, they put a lot of stock in dreams. Again, not a biblical teaching as much as just a cultural reflection on what kind of world we're delving into here, and that is that these dreams had meaning. And in this case, of course, it had great meaning. And maybe a dream is a version of reality that God knows he can get into our innermost, symbolic thoughts, that if he did it in reality, it would freak us out. We wouldn't be able to, kind of Daniel 10, where he does actually get paralyzed when this being talks to him. So maybe in lieu of being paralyzed, God gives us, or in this case, God gave Jacob a dream. So it was less painful to his existential reality, shall we say. Anyway, he wakes up from his dream, and here's his words. Surely Yahweh is in this place, and I did not know it. Now there's a portal concept right there. Right? He's saying, from all the conversations we've had of Yahweh, in fact, even Rebecca, I remember, goes to inquire of Yahweh back in 25:22. Here we have someone actually using portal language. Yahweh is in this place, and I did not know it. And he was afraid, and he said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of Elohim, Beth Elohim, Beit, house, Elohim, God. And this is the comma is important, because this is another way of saying in parallel terms the same thing. So house of God, comma, the gate of heaven. I'd recommend that the text at least, let me throw this at you, Mike. The text at least wants the narrator, the writer wants me, the reader, to believe this. He wants me to believe that Jacob believed that this was an actual gate of heaven. This is where beings come and go, as opposed to 20 miles away. In other words, this is the actual spot on earth in which God moves up, and that God's, plural, move up and down. Can I, as I throw that out, I mentioned this in Genesis 14, that Melchizedek appearing out of nowhere, worshiping Yahweh by a different name, is interesting, but it also leads us down this path of wondering, is there something special about Salem or Jerusalem or Zion? There's different ways of saying the same place. In Deuteronomy 16:16, God will, now of course we're in Genesis here, but someday Yahweh will say to Moses, have the males of Israel appear in the place I will choose 3 times a year, so that they may come before me. That kind of language is used again. Deuteronomy 16:16. 31:11, it's repeated. 3 times a year, have all the males come and appear before Yahweh in the place I will choose. Seems to be very specific about a location to which they will come. In 1 Chronicles 21:16 through 29, it's kind of a elongated story, but I'll cap it quickly. King David, is trying to build a temple or bring the tabernacle in, and he comes to a place where he meets a messenger of God. Again, it could be let's not get into that one, what kind of messenger it is, because he's pretty violent. But the point is that he even says in fact, I'll turn to it, 1 Chronicles 21:26. 1 Chronicles 21:26. This is the kind of verse, again, a Divine Counsel Worldview reader will look at and say, ooh, my, what do I do with this? David built there an altar to Yahweh, and burnt offerings and peace offerings there he offered, and called on Yahweh. And he, Yahweh, answered him from heaven by fire, That's pretty rare that you get that kind of immediate boom on the top of an altar. Then Yahweh commanded the angel, the messenger, and he returned his sword to its sheath. Again, so some kind of messenger was going up and down, apparently, or at least he was located on that spot. At that time, when David saw that Yahweh had answered him on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite, he sacrificed there. For the tabernacle, notice how it argues this. For the tabernacle of Yahweh and the altar of the burnt offering which Moses had made in the wilderness were at that time at the high place in Gibeon. In other words, it makes that comment purposely to say David sacrificed on this spot, but the tabernacle, which you would associate with God's presence, was 20 miles away. Next verse, but David could not go before it to inquire of Elohim, for he was afraid of the sword of the messenger of Yahweh. So I would argue that 1 Chronicles 21 is another portal, and it just so happens to be Zion, Jerusalem, Salem. What Psalm 76:2 says, Yahweh, when it says Yahweh dwells in Zion, thus is the psalmist wanting me, the reader, to really believe that there's something special about, and in my theology, in other words, what I'm saying as a Divine Council reader, I've got two spots that the Old Testament seems to locate as gates of heaven, or places that the reader, the narrator, stops and says, this was unique. And I know God can be anywhere. That's not at play. The question is, are there spots on earth that God has seemed to either historically or potentially use as a landing spot for a portal? But it just sounds weird to say it. But the gate of heaven, the two I have in my mind are Bethel and Jerusalem, which then, when you think about it, when Rehoboam, does his thing to the northern kingdom, or the 10 tribes, guess where they put their altar? In Bethel and Dan, which again has a whole discussion to that. So anyway, I think we're on topic because we're on Genesis 28, but you can sense how this kind of story sends us flying through the rest of the scripture.
I think there is something, there is also we have to remember that culturally they did have this concept of portals. They were just so familiar with it. There is this almost like an accommodation that God is doing here, right? Because if Jacob is, like we're saying, right, we're doing this little mini experiment with Jacob. If he's feeling God out and he's feeling out like, is Yahweh the one that I want to actually like be loyal to? He's using the language and wordage and theology, the cosmology of his people's time, of like just that era, right? Like that deities were tied to the land, and that specific lands or territories were the possessions or the administrative power of these different deities. So he's stating, at least here, he's still feeling it out. Yahweh has control over this territory here. That this land is so special because of this must be the house of El, the house of God. And so there is almost like this accommodation in some sense that God is doing, like, all right, let me just work with what I have right now. You understand the spiritual world this way. Let's go with that. Let's go with what I'll introduce myself here. So at least you can start realizing, yeah, I'm introducing myself. I'm Yahweh. Hello. I'm the God of your father, Abraham and Isaac. And we'll just go from there. One thing I do want to add in, I thought this was interesting because I remember back in the time, right, Dr. Heiser, Mike would talk a lot about, like, especially this word that would often show up in the Aramaic translations, in the Targums. And I noticed it here in verse 15 of the same chapter in the Aramaic, where Yahweh is talking. He says, and behold, I in my memra am with you and shall keep you wherever you go, and I will make you return to this land, because my memra shall not forsake you until I have done what I spoke to you. And then Jacob's response in the Aramaic version says, behold, truly the glory of the Shekinah of the Lord. It dwells in this place, and I did not know it. I've
heard that the Aramaic sometimes, will put Shekinah into the text where Yahweh appears in the Masoretic text. That
Yeah.
they have what some interpreters take that to mean a discomfort in putting Yahweh himself somewhere, and they'll put his Shekinah or his Memra into, and again, another Aramaic word, in its place. I don't know if there's a theological reason they put Shekinah in place of, often translated as glory, in place of Yahweh himself, but I don't know.
It's just a very interesting, like, again, like that thought world, right? That the Memra and the Shekinah are so in close proximity here in 15 and 16 for the Aramaic translators. I just find that fascinating.
Yeah. Well, so far we have, thank you. So far we have, at least at the end of 17, as I said, and you agree, that the gate of heaven concept is something the narrator wants us to believe in, whether or not it's literal or, it's kind of weird. I don't know if I can believe in that. At least at this point, the story is trying to make us say, take this seriously. Jacob was amazed at what happened in this spot of ground, and he calls it Bethel, house of deity. Again, we all know that El, who's the chief god of the Canaanite pantheon, he's not calling it the house of the chief god of the Canaanite pantheon. He's calling it the house of El, which is short form for Eloah, which is short form for Elohim. So Bethel can just mean house of deities or house of God, small g there. It doesn't have to be Yahweh in its place, but again, we don't have to struggle with the word at this point. The name of the city had been called Luz. Verse 20, let's do that because, 20, I skipped 18. Jacob rose early in the morning, took the stone that he had put at his head and made it a pillar. By the time you get to Deuteronomy 16, there's going to be this don't make pillar argument, because don't make pillars, because by the time Moses is dealing with his people in later Deuteronomy, the warning will come up. You're so used to doing this that you're misusing these for the worship of other deities. So the prohibition of doing verse 18 will come later. And Jacob doing it now is not wrong. It's just that someday it's going to be misused in the worship of other deities to the point that God himself will say, just don't do it. Verse 20, then Jacob made a vow or a deal. If God be with me and keep me in this way that I'm going, and give me bread to eat and clothing to put on, so that I come back to my father's house in peace. If everything goes well between now and then, you got to love this line, then Yahweh shall be my deity. So, should we criticize him for that? Or I'd recommend, I guess I'm going to go with the side, for anyone's path toward God, even today, doesn't this sound just like, if not in reality, at least in symbol form, much like how we talk to God today, that you're not putting God at a disadvantage when you say to him, maybe under your breath, I'm willing to follow you if, and you start hearing yourself say things that, even 5 years from now, you're going to look back and say, boy, that was, I shouldn't have said that. Is God big enough, or even kind enough, gracious enough, merciful enough, patient enough to answer the prayer of a Jacob who is going through a struggle and fulfill this kind of a if condition? I know we never teach this to a modern Christian audience. Don't ever say if to God, right? But we're not there yet. And I would recommend, and I'm turning my question, I guess, into my answer, so feel free to respond. But I don't blame Jacob for this. I think he's saying exactly what the psalmist will say, in a sense of, oh God, where are you? Why don't you wake up? You have some of the Psalms saying some pretty scary things. And here it's just oh God, oh Yahweh, I'm willing to make you my deity, which is a huge thing. To run my day by you and not by another deity is going to take a lot, and I'm willing to do that, but I need to know you're real. So I like 20 and 21. To me, this sounds like my, how I sometimes sound as well. And yes, it could be argued, don't do it, but I would never pull this out and moralize it. So what do you think?
Yeah, I would agree. And I think, 20 is very, it's indicative of where Jacob probably is in his progress in his spiritual journey, right? Because he says, if God, and so he's not even saying my God or my dad's God. It's just like, all right, that was a very interesting dream. This is a fearsome place. All right, I'm just going to see, and I'm going to test drive this. I'm going to play this out. And I think we often forget that also the context of this is he is running away from Esau. Yeah. Right? He hasn't even gotten to Laban's place yet. He's still on his journey. And so he's probably at a point where he's left his parents' home. He's running away from Esau. He has a lot of probably a sense of anxiety because Esau promised, I'm going to kill you once our dad's dead. And there is this kind of fear. And now it's like, all right, I just met something that's even more fearsome than Esau. So let me play this out then. If this God will take care of me, if this God of my fathers is actually who he says he is, then let's test this out. And then he shall be my God if he actually proves true.
Yeah. Well, we're going to see this deity talk to, or, well, if anyone wants to look, 31:13 will say, well, Jacob's going to be repeating the story about an angel talking to him, and he'll say, or a deity, and he'll say, I am the God of Bethel. That's the person talking, where you anointed the pillar and where you made this deal with me. So Yahweh will remember this if clause of chapter 28 in 31:13, as though God himself is taking it seriously and is willing to be a part of it. He's willing to take the if and say, okay, watch what I can do. And then by the time you get to 31:42, again, he's pulling on this if when he says, unless the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had been with me, surely now you would have sent me away empty-handed, talking to Laban. So he's going to pull back, or remember this if clause as though it really is real. And he's going to look at Laban and say in so many words, God upheld his part of the bargain. So guess what? I'm going to take him. And but we're getting ahead. That's just a fascinating part of what happens.
Well, I love that you brought that up, Ron, because that also does indicate it indicates that God is ever observing, right? Because Jacob could have said this, and there was no reason for God to then remind Jacob. Mm-hmm. Do you remember when you did that? That it's sort of like you did do this. I'm not forgetting that you did this because I saw you do this, and
you made
this kind of tactic shows up all the time throughout the Old Testament. Like in the book of Job, in chapter 3, Job will say certain things in his opening speech to his friends, and then when Yahweh appears from the whirlwind in chapter 38, there are these allusions from chapter 3 that he brings up with Job. It's sort of indicating, yeah, Job, I was listening to this as well.
I have a better memory than you do. Yeah. It's cool. It's also scary at the same time that God remembers what I'm saying. Well, that's coming into Jesus' recommendation. Just say yes and no. Don't get into vow making because God remembers what you say. Mm-hmm. 30 back to 28:21. Then Yahweh shall be my Elohim, and this stone which I have set as a pillar shall be God's house, and of all that you give me, I will surely give 1/10 to you. Talking again to Yahweh, apparently at this point. Bethel, again, in the history of Israel, will be a place that the minor prophets will talk about going to Bethel and sinning. In other words, it becomes this, as beautiful as this story is, this gate of heaven story, where Yahweh is standing at the top of a stairway, it becomes a scene to play it out in the history of Israel of intense worship toward other deities. So that's not God's fault. That's, again, this idea of a portal that they probably saw this as a place to make an altar and to do their work. Now, whether it wasn't a portal or not, it doesn't matter. That this is the spot upon which Israel, the 10 tribes, will become heinous in their worship. Mm. I take it to be the sin of Matthew 1:21, that Jesus came to save his people from this very sin of going to the worship of other deities. all I want to do, and I think we can close it up with this, is say in 29 and 30, which I said we'd handle. Let me just recommend that from a Divine Council worldview standpoint, there's not much I want to add to 29 and 30, because it really is the story of Laban, verse 5, 29:5. He said to them, "Do you know Laban, the son of Nahor?" And we're going to be wondering as Jacob goes north and meets his uncle, so what is this guy like? Is he a Yahwist or not? Back in, I'm going to pull it up quick. When they were trying to find a bride for Isaac, we had Laban say in verse chapter 20, it's on the left side. Here it is, 24:50. Then Laban and his dad Bethuel answered and said, "The thing comes from Yahweh. We cannot speak to you either good or bad." So there's the only evidence we have in the story that Laban is a Yahwist is coming from chapter 24, which, to be fair, doesn't give a lot about him, but at least we have the name or the concept of Yahweh on Laban's lips. But now that we meet him in 29 and 30, we're going to have this struggle between Jacob and Laban because of his daughter Rachel. And Rachel comes and meets him in verse 6. Chapter 29, verse 6 is the first mention of Rachel in the Bible. She is, verse 10, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother. In other words, he will marry his first cousin. I read somewhere just lately that 20% of worldwide marriages are still among or between first cousins. Consanguineous, how you say that, marriage, is when cousins marry. Albert Einstein, Charles Darwin are examples of people who married their cousins. So it's pretty common. That's what happens here. And of course, a person can read the story on their own, but Laban makes this deal. Since you're my relative, verse 15, I'll give you my daughter. But he has two daughters, verse 16, one Leah, one Rachel. Jacob, verse 18, loves Rachel, prefers Rachel. He says, I'm going to serve you 7 years for her. It's the bride price, the idea of paying money that Rachel gets to keep in case of divorce or desertion. One commentator says it's about 7 years would be almost double what a person would give for a bride in that day. Of course, Laban tricks him, and in the darkness of night, he finds out that it's Leah. His answer, verse 26, is, well, it's not done in our country any other way. We always have to give away the younger after the older. So we give the older first. That's why you had Leah. Then Laban also gives, and he serves another 7 years. He apparently gets to have Rachel sooner than the 7 years, but the point is he's going to be there 14 years total. He also gives her or him Zilpah, verse 24, and Bilhah, verse 29, as concubines. So the story is that Jacob goes up to Haran, gets one preferred wife, another not preferred wife in Leah, and also 2 handmaids, so 4 in all. And then all we need to do, I hope I'm not cheating the system here or our study, but he has Reuben in 29:32, firstborn from Leah, Simeon born in verse 33, again through Leah, Levi born in verse 34, again to Leah, and then Judah born to Leah in verse 35. So 4 sons are born to Jacob through Leah, the less loved wife. Then in chapter 30, I wouldn't even see this as a chapter break, but it's just continuing. And through Bilhah, he has Dan in verse 6, Naphtali in verse 8, Zilpah then has Gad in verse 11. Notice who's naming the child. It's not the handmaid, but the wife. Leah names the child, even though Zilpah gives him the baby. Same thing happens in verse 13, where Leah names Zilpah's boy Asher. So now we have 8 boys. Probably some girls born along the way too, but 8 boys. Issachar is born in verse 18. That's Leah. That's the 9th boy. Zebulun in 20. Dinah is in 21. I think she's only named because she will come up later in the story of Genesis.
Yeah.
And then Rachel, finally in verse 22. God remembers Rachel. She's now 91 years old. We learn by comparing texts. So she is old herself. This would be Jacob is 91, not Rachel. And God listened to her and opened her womb. She conceived and bore a son, called his name Joseph. And she said, Yahweh shall add to me another son. Of course, in 35:16, down the way, Benjamin is born. So the point of chapters 29 and 30, just in the narrative sense, are the birth of 12 boys who become the 12 tribes. And there's different ways to itemize the tribes, but generally speaking, these are the tribal names that we just went over. One other thing I want to mention in this chapter, and again, so much weird things, shall we say, going on culturally about the rods and the flocks that are inbred here. If you want to read it again, have a study Bible close at hand because it's a strange story. But the point is verse 25. It came to pass when Rachel had borne Joseph that Jacob said to Laban, send me away that I may go to my place and my country. So the story is ending here with him leaving with his 2 wives, 2 concubines, and 12 boys. Give me my wives and my children for whom I have served you, and let me go. For you know my service which I have done for you. And Laban said, please stay, for I have found favor, if in your eyes. For I have learned by divination. It's the first use of this term, nakash, as a translation of divination in the text. It's going to be repeated in 44:5 and 44:15 when Joseph does it. He says he's using divination in front of his brothers at that point. My New King James puts the word experience. I don't know why it doesn't want the word divination there. What does your text have?
The ESV says divination.
Good. Okay. So I have learned by divination that Yahweh has blessed me for your sake. So Laban, at least in the story, claims he somehow inquired of Yahweh, and through some kind of, divination, which is always, sorcery, things like this. That's how it's translated elsewhere in the Old Testament. It's always condemned this way going forward. So God will never want us to do it going forward, at least as an Israelite. But in this story, it seems to be allowed through at least the narrative that he does something to get Yahweh's will known. I've learned by divination that Yahweh has blessed me for your sake. Maybe it's pulling on that if vow that he had made. Well, then he says, name me your wages. And through, again, we're not sure how this all works. At least I'm not. If you can help me out, Mike, please do. But 41, at the end of 30, verse 41, it came to pass whenever the stronger livestock conceived that Jacob placed the rods before the eyes of the livestock in the gutters that they might conceive among the rods. Again, I'm not a farmer. But when the flocks were feeble, he did not put them in. So the feebler were Laban's and the stronger were Jacob's. I don't see magic here as much as maybe just good husbandry. Thus the man became exceedingly prosperous. And here's how we'll close our podcast this time. He had large flocks, female and male servants, and camels and donkeys. He's a Bill Gates of his day. He's a rich man, and that's how you measure wealth. In other words, the if, and I would tie it, I'm not going to do it with my own pen, but if I could draw a line from the if of, what verse was it, 28:20. If God will do this for me, give me bread, give me clothing, then I will. And that brings us to the last verse of 30. In other words, God upheld his part of the bargain. So now let's see how it's going to go from here. And notice it's going to be another meeting between him and God at the start of 31. So we'll do that next time. Anything you want to add in conclusion, Mike?
Well, I do think it's interesting, right? Like, because of time's sake, I know we had to, yes, 29 and 30 is really just the formation of what eventually would become known as the 12 or even 13 tribes eventually. But what I do find interesting is that, especially when we get to when we're talking about Leah, right? It seems clear. And I mean, like, it's sort of just the emotion of like, well, I just married this guy and he clearly actually likes my younger sister. He wished he didn't marry me. And so she's trying to gain his favor towards the end. And yet by the final son that she's able to conceive with him, with Judah, and I'm trying to find that line where she finally declares essentially something about Yahweh connected to all this.
Last verse of chapter 29. I will praise Yahweh.
And therefore she called his name
Judah. Yeah.
There's something, it's always kind of an interesting kind of theological retrieval of like, what was Leah's own journey through this, right? In some sense, we're seeing towards the end, very briefly, she herself is going through all this and she's even naming, and she's using Yahweh's name as she's naming these children, right? Like Reuben, because the Lord has looked upon my affliction, and then eventually Simeon, because the Lord has heard me. That she's calling out, ironically. She seems to actually have a little bit more of a loyalty towards Yahweh.
Yeah.
And she's depending upon him. So it is an interesting kind of journey to see that as well.
Hint, 31 is going to have one of those two girls stealing idols, and it's not Leah.
Yeah.
So maybe Rachel's having a bigger struggle with her Yahwism than Leah is. I don't know.
So even in these
I
two
don't have time
chapters,
to study that out, but it'd be fun to do.
But it is interesting, right? That even in these two chapters, like that question that we've been playing around with of like, which deity are you loyal to? That even here we get glimpses of that, at least with Leah, that consistently with her sons, she's been depending and calling upon Yahweh.
Yeah, again, just in maybe I don't want to open up a new study, but look at 31 compared to 35. Chapter 29, verse 31. When Yahweh saw that Leah was unloved, he opened her womb. So is it fair to say Yahweh was her deity? That we, at least from the storyboard here, the one running her womb is Yahweh. Not that he's not running everyone's womb ultimately, but the story is clearly put in Yahweh's court there.
And there's a graciousness in some sense, right? Because I mean, I've seen depictions of this on live action TV before. I don't know if they ever really capture just the sense of like despair of what that must have felt like. Right, you had a great wedding night, and I don't know however Laban convinced Leah, or maybe he didn't even tell her that, oh yeah, he actually wanted to marry your sister, but I'm putting you in her place instead. I don't know, right. But it's just like, wow. And then to have a supposedly a great wedding night, and then to discover, oh no, he didn't want you, he wanted your younger sister, and to know that throughout the entire, the rest of her life with him, that she was never the preferred wife. And yet, ironically, she's the one that can bear him his first set of sons. So it's very interesting. And I think there is a kindness that God showed to her, because she wasn't going to receive that same kind of affection from Jacob.
Yeah. And we got to close, but I'm questioning whether... Does Leah get buried in the tomb that Abraham buys? I don't think so.
Let me quickly look at all the instances.
Yes, Leah is. Leah is included. It's Isaac in that cave of Machpelah. Abraham, Isaac, Rebekah, Sarah, Leah, and Jacob. So Leah does get. Rachel gets her own tomb near Bethlehem.
Interesting.
Rachel is not in that tomb. Well, we could talk all day, Mike. We can't. Got to go. I've got a birthday party for my oldest grandson coming up this afternoon, so that's where I'm going. What are you going to do?
I have more meetings or stuff that I got to do.
My day's funner than yours is.
It is. Definitely sounds like it will be. but
All right.
still good.
Well, I'm sorry. Were you going to say?
I just said it's still good in the end. But yeah, this was a fun exploration of just. I don't know. I have a soft spot for Leah. I think there's that thing of. I just love the fact that she was naming her children and thinking of Yahweh in the midst of all that.
Yeah. When you say soft spot, this is what I thought you meant, but I'm going to bring it into this, that I have a soft spot for just talking like this. To me, a Bible study with a cup of coffee, looking at the text, looking for what's important to the story, which I'd recommend is which God are you looking at here and which God is doing the work. It's so fascinating. And I could do this all day, and we will. All right. Thank you, everyone. We'll talk to you next time.